a roadmap for a coup, inside Trump's plot to steal the presidency. On 4th of January, the conservative lawyer John Eastman was summoned to the Oval Office to meet Donald Trump and Vice President Mike Pence. Within 48 hours, Joe Biden's victory in the 2020 presidential election would formally be certified by Congress, sealing Trump's fate and removing him from the White House. The atmosphere in the room was tense. The then U.S. president was fired up to make what amounted to a last-ditch effort to overturn the election results and snatch a second term in office in the most powerful job on earth. Eastman, who had a decades-long reputation as a prominent conservative law professor, had already prepared a two-page memo in which he had outlined an incendiary scenario under which Pence, presiding over the joint session of Congress that was to be convened on 6th of January, effectively overrides the votes of millions of Americans in 7 states that Biden had won, then gavels President Trump as re-elected. The Eastman memo, first revealed by Bob Woodward and Robert Costa in their book Peril, goes on to predict howls of protest from Democrats. The theory was that Pence, acting as the ultimate arbiter of the process, would then send the matter to the House of Representatives which, following an arcane rule that says that where no candidate has reached the necessary majority each state will have one vote, also decides to turn the world upside down and hand the election to the losing candidate, Donald Trump. Eastman's by now notorious memo, and the surreal encounter in the Oval Office, are among the central twists in the unfolding story of Trump's audacious bid to hang on to power. They form the basis of what critics argue was nothing less than an attempted electoral coup. In an interview with The Guardian, Eastman explained that he had been asked to prepare the memo by one of Trump's legal shop. Inside the Oval Office, with the countdown onto 6th of January, Trump urged Pence to listen closely to Eastman. "This guy's a really respected constitutional lawyer," the president said, "according to the book I Alone Can Fix It." Eastman, a member of the influential right-wing Federalist Society, told The Guardian that he made clear to both men that the account he had laid out in the short memo was not his preferred option. "The advice I gave the vice president very explicitly was that I did not think he had the authority simply to declare which electors to count, or the advice I gave the vice president very explicitly was that I did not think he had the authority simply to declare which electors to count." Eastman continued, "The vice president turned to me directly and said, 'Do you think I have such powers?' I said, 'I think it's the weaker argument.'" Instead, Eastman pointed to one of the scenarios in the longer 6-page memo that he had prepared, wargaming alternatives. His favorite was that the vice president could adjourn the joint session of Congress on 6th of January and send the Electoral College votes back to states that Trump claimed he had lost unfairly so their legislatures could have another go at rooting out the fraud and illegality the president had been railing about since Election Day. "My advice to the vice president was to allow the states formally to assess the impact of what they had determined were clear illegalities in the conduct of the election," Eastman said. "After a delay of a week or 10 days, if they found sufficient fraud to affect the result, they could then send Trump electors back to Congress in place of the previous Biden ones. The election would then be overturned. Those votes are counted and Trump wins," Eastman wrote in his longer memo, adding brashly, "Bold, certainly, but we're no longer playing by Queensberry rules." Eastman insisted to The Guardian that he had only been presenting scenarios to the vice president, not advice. He said that since news of his memos broke, he had become the victim of a false narrative put out there to make it look as though Pence had been asked to do something egregiously unconstitutional, so he was made to look like a white knight coming in to stop this authoritarian Trump. The problem is that for many close observers of American elections, Eastman's presentation to Pence just 2 days before the vice president was set to certify Biden's victory leaves a very different impression. Advertisement. Michael Waldman, president of the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University, a leading authority on U.S. election issues, sees Eastman's set of alternative scenarios as nothing less than a fairly detailed roadmap for a constitutional coup d'etat. That memo was a plan for a series of tricks to steal the presidency for Trump. The 2020 presidential election was the largest in U.S. history, with a record 156 million votes cast and the highest turnout of eligible voters since 1900. By all official accounts, it was also among the most secure and well-conducted in U.S. history. "It was something of a civil miracle," Waldman said. "It was something of a civil miracle." And yet, Waldman went on, what happened next? Trump's big lie, his campaign to overturn the election, the insurrection. Alarm bells began to ring months before America went to the polls on November 3, 2020. As early as July, Trump was laying into mail-in voting. which was seeing huge voter take-up as a result of COVID-19, deriding the upcoming poll as the most inaccurate and fraudulent election in history and calling for it to be delayed. At the time, Biden was holding a steady opinion poll lead over Trump in battleground states. By September, Trump was refusing to commit to a peaceful transfer of power. He told reporters, "We're going to have to see what happens." When we did see what happened, Biden winning the presidency by a relatively convincing margin, Trump refused to concede. Now, something that had only been posited as a remote and extreme possibility was unfolding before Americans' eyes. "The events of 2020 were unprecedented," said Ned Foley, a law professor at The Ohio State University. "The events of 2020 were unprecedented. Since the violent incidents of 6th of January when a mob of Trump supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol, resulting in the deaths of 5 people, information has begun to amass about Trump's extensive ploy to undo American democracy. Congressional investigations by the U.S. House and Senate have added granular detail that has astonished even seasoned election watchers in terms of the scale and complexity of the endeavor." For Foley, a picture has come into focus of a systematic effort to deny the voters their democratic choice. It was a deliberate, orchestrated campaign, and there's nothing more fundamentally undemocratic than what was attempted. Rick Hassan, a law professor at the University of California, Irvine who has written a report on 2020 election subversion, said that as time has passed the scope of Trump's ambition has become clear. "There was much more behind the scenes than we knew about. We came much closer to a political and constitutional crisis than we realized," he said.